Okay. Good afternoon. It's really good to be here. I was telling my colleague Mike Black earlier today that some of my earliest professional travel was coming here about 15 years ago. I remember staying at the Embassy Suites, and to give you a sense for how early in my career and how naive I was about corporate travel, I checked in at the Embassy Suites, and they said, Mr. Anderson, your suite will be number 342. And I sort of smiled and stepped away from the check-in counter and went to my boss and said, there must be a mistake. They've given me a suite. I was like a year out of college. And she said, what do you mean? I said, it's just me. I'm nobody, and they're giving me a suite. She said, they're all suites at the Embassy Suites. It's pretty incredible to see, even in these last 15 years, how much has changed here. And in those days, I was helping build workshops about doing business with Walmart, and Walmart.com was around, but it was not quite the priority that it is now. And of course, people had heard of Amazon, but it wasn't quite the phenomenon that it is now, and way before Jet and so on. So it's sort of funny how things have come full circle in some ways. So I lead strategy for Profitero. We are an e-commerce performance analytics partner to almost 100 brands globally. I lead product strategy, which means what kind of analytics do we need to offer and how can we deliver them, and then a team of analysts that works with our clients, basically helping them identify and prioritize and take action on the things that are going to move the needle. So what I wanted to cover today is almost a hybrid of some of what you have been hearing, really with an emphasis on how to focus. Because I think many of you, just in conversations I've had during breaks and elsewhere, it's very clear this is overwhelming. Whether you've been doing it for years, whether you've just been assigned or you're just curious, it can be overwhelming. So hopefully, if you take nothing else from this discussion, that's what you'll take. We're going to talk about really 4 big topics: defining success, and I'll explain why that's really important; fielding a team, and that means both working with the team that you've got, and I hope to give you some ammunition to expand your team; tools and technology or capabilities, as you might hear it called; and then finally, the main focus: where do you focus? So, just to introduce why it's so important to define success, whether you're operating purely on one platform or one site like Walmart.com or Jet, or you're responsible for Walmart and Jet in the U.S. and Canada and Walmart Grocery, and you may have a larger portfolio, as somebody I spoke with earlier today is. It's so important that both you personally and the people that you report to and that you have as colleagues are both clear and aligned on what success means and why you're doing this. And we've heard people throughout the day mention both the opportunity and also some of the challenges. Sometimes the economics and the returns are difficult to come by, or we're doing it maybe for the growth in some cases, and in other cases maybe because Walmart is our largest retail customer globally, and they've asked us to. So there are many reasons you can do business online. There are many reasons you can do business with any of these platforms, and they're all valid, but what's so important is to know which one or which of them are most important for your company, the role that these platforms and the channel play in the broader context of what you're doing, and how you're going to measure success. Because knowing where to focus has everything to do with what your objectives and goals are and how you're going to measure progress against those. And I've worked with tons and tons of companies that go into this sort of paralyzed because they don't know what a win looks like. They may think it's growth, or they may think it's profitability, or they may think it's getting designated an online category captain, and all of these are interesting and compelling things to do, but you really do want to go into it with some clarity about that. And I mentioned, what are harder objectives. These tend to be more quantitative and measurable. They're what most companies have standard reporting on. And then there are softer objectives, and you've heard a lot of references to offline influence, and this is an increasingly key part of how you'll engage with a retailer like Walmart more broadly. They're increasingly thinking of this as part of your overall engagement with them. So just be clear, not only for yourself, but with some of your colleagues, here's what we're really trying to do. This one, you may have to squint a little bit to see. And you're going to hear me today reference a lot of things that are not on the screen. So just email me at keith@profitero.com or find me on LinkedIn, because we don't have time for me to show you all the slides and all the supporting material that I want you to know is there. And if you think it would be helpful, just drop me a note and I'll pass it along. But I think in this room, we've got teams and companies and individuals, some that are sort of on day one in the first inning of their e-commerce journey with very limited support, and others that maybe are part of very large dedicated teams. And so part of what I think is important before you jump in and start doing all the work is to think about what is the work, and then how are we going to define roles and responsibilities. So we've done a couple studies over the last few years using two methodologies. One is surveying more than 100 manufacturers about how they budget and organize for e-commerce, and the other is actually looking on LinkedIn, which is the best database of professional people that we can identify, and looking at people who in their full-time day job are dedicated to e-commerce. And this is sort of an outline, without all the data behind it, of how we see companies organizing. So I'll tell you how to interpret it a little bit. And this is one of the slides where if you want to see the complete study behind it, just email me. So I think you saw some material earlier today that aligns pretty closely with what we've seen in terms of where this function tends to report. We often see it report to sales. In fact, 3/4 of the companies that responded to our study said it reports into sales. And that's important because in those companies, you tend to see a really clear focus on the harder objectives. We want growth, we want greater than our fair share, or at least our fair share, and eventually we want it to be profitable. But in some companies, it either reports to marketing or is a dotted line to marketing. And in most companies, there is somebody at headquarters with a general manager or director or vice president role, and that person typically defines the company's strategy, works on organizational structure, helps build the toolkit, and then perhaps shares some leading practices for how to go perform. And this is an interesting role, especially as it relates to account teams. So some of the conversations that I've already had today are with people who sit at the account level, and so you'll see, key customer team, and actually in a slightly more detailed version of the chart, there's a distinction between pure play teams, or for example, an Amazon team, and an Omni or a brick-and-mortar.com team, because they tend to get resourced a little differently, and they tend to play different roles in how decisions get made. And I acknowledge that with this group simply because it can be frustrating and challenging as you're trying to get the team and support and resources and tools that you need to get things done when you're not at headquarters. If you're outposted, you may be sort of informed, but not always consulted. And part of what you've got to do to succeed is be sure that you're building the relationships, not only with the retailer, but back at headquarters, staying aware of what their goals are, their objectives, and making sure that what you're hearing and what you know needs to be reflected in their strategy and their goals and objectives is making it onto their radar. That can be challenging. It's not something you'll typically see in your job description, but it's important because almost by definition, they're at 30,000 feet and arm's length from the work that you might be doing here. So it's important to engage them. You'll see there's some color coding. There's a half dozen, maybe even more specialist functions that in the companies with the most mature, most fully resourced structures, they've got specialists basically in most of these areas, not necessarily focused purely on e-commerce, but focused at the intersection of e-commerce and supply chain, or doing financial analysis to help inform and guide decisions about e-commerce, and on down the list. And the color coding reflects some of the areas that you'll commonly see either fully outsourced to a consultant, a broker, or an agency, or at least where there's some engagement with those kind of partners. And whether or how to work with those is a pretty important discussion. Because in some cases it could be the way your company manages budgeting. You don't have allocation for full-time in-house employees. And in other cases, you may want to hire somebody or several somebodies, but you need the results sooner. So I think it's actually a fantastic thing to outsource or at least partner with companies. I do have a couple thoughts on how to get the most out of those relationships. One, you want to be sure to define success. Every time basically any initiative, you need to be clear going in, what will success look like, and be sure you communicate that with the partner and get their explicit agreement. Yep, we understand that, and that's something we're comfortable doing. Number two, don't keep them at arm's length. So, whether you outsource is a decision that's really personal to your context. But no matter what you decide, if it's work that you think may eventually be strategic, it's very challenging to get sustained competitive advantage if you're renting capability that your competitors can also rent. And it's also going to be difficult to build any sustainable advantage if you aren't at least learning from that relationship. So you should hire some of the people that, if you don't want to call them experts, have done the work themselves or have a lot of experience doing it. But you want to be asking them every step of the way, at every opportunity, why'd you do that? How'd you do that? Have you thought about doing this? Because that way you're both sort of getting the result through the relationship, but you're also building some of that in-house expertise and capability. As part of that study, we asked, for various accounts, where do you have dedicated account level support for e-commerce? And unsurprisingly, I think Amazon is the account that has the most dedicated support, and that increased in the most recent survey we did versus the previous year. It also increased, although not as much, for Walmart. And interestingly, Target actually saw a little bit of a decline. But what I really wanted to emphasize is the distinction between dedicated and designated support for e-commerce or really any function. And dedicated simply means that it's the primary or sole focus. And designated means, in addition to everything else, I'd like you to focus on this as well. And there's sort of a hierarchy. If you don't have anybody at all, this is just work that's left to chance, you're going to get the worst result. If nobody has a responsibility for it, it doesn't get done. So if you don't have the budget or the resource to dedicate somebody, you can designate somebody. But the truth is, if it's not the primary or the sole focus, say you're responsible for e-commerce and shopper marketing and something else, and it's not part of how you're measured or incentivized, really understandably, nobody is going to give it the attention it deserves. So there is a rationale for designating someone responsible for the work on a pathway to dedicating people. but it's not the optimal way to support the work. Ultimately, you want to dedicate people either internally or externally if you can. Now, not to all of the work, not to every function. And again, I emphasize it really depends on your context. In the data that we developed through LinkedIn and through the survey, we have companies that have basically one-man bands or one-woman bands that work with agencies and consultants externally as dedicated support for some of these functions. And then we had teams like this Amazon team that's got, I think, 8 full-time people, very experienced people in roles specializing purely on media and marketing for Amazon and purely on content and purely on supply chain and on down the list. And I share this not because this is necessarily what's right to do for this context, and even for Amazon or every company, but it does help you start to think about how companies are focusing the work and trying to identify the most important work, and then clearly define roles and responsibilities internally and externally to support it. This is not an exhaustive list of the various tools in the possible toolkit, but you'll see some of the companies that are here named and others that may not be. And I include this because once you've defined success, there's a whole exercise around defining strategy that we didn't cover today because there's just not time. But then you're going to want to figure out what your team looks like. And then you're going to want to build the toolkit. And you've heard, I think, some really important ideas and leading practices today that can be made much more efficient and effective if you have the right tools. And the reality is, there are tools at every price point and to fit every budget. There are tools that you can afford if you're going to establish a third-party seller presence out of your basement. And there are tools that might be a better fit if you're a Fortune 100 multinational supplier. The main point of including something like this in a discussion like this is to give you a sense of what the toolkit might contain. If you don't plan to manage sales in-house, you'll almost certainly want to work with a broker that's going to manage all of the work that you've heard described today, from listing items, managing supply, and so on. If you don't plan to do some of the marketing yourself, you'll want an agency. Content, everybody's heard a lot about. I'm not going to go too deep into the toolkit for content, but I will simply say it is really important, and not only at this retailer, but almost every one of your companies of a certain scale is going to be working on initiatives to centralize how they generate content, store it, manage it, syndicate it, and so on. I will talk in a second about the sort of virtuous cycle of how that work gets managed. But you'll need some tools, whether you home grow them or you find a partner to help you manage, syndicate, and analyze that content. Data is something I am going to spend a minute on because the reality is it is the lifeblood of this business, not just e-commerce, brick and mortar, and it's essential to helping focus your efforts on the activities that yield the biggest impact, which is so important. The whole reason that I structured my talk today around focusing is, for as long as I've been doing this, almost everybody I encounter, especially when they're early in, is just paralyzed with all the things that you could do. And that even includes, studying the various types of data. So this is not a Connect 4 board. And it's also not a chart that I'm going to walk you through in complete detail. I'll explain to you how you can interpret it and make the key point, which is there are different types of data. For all retail, I picked a half dozen or so that are really central to how you measure and manage your e-commerce business. Some come from the retailers themselves. I call that direct data. You've heard a lot about that today. It's the platinum standard in some ways, because at least you know that the retailer will agree with it. It may be hard to access, it may be questionably accurate, sometimes they'll charge you for it. There's all kinds of shortcomings and challenges, but you can sing from the same hymnal if it comes directly from the retailer. Then there's data from the big data companies like Nielsen, who's our partner. We're Nielsen's preferred e-commerce analytics partner, or IRI or NPD or others. And in the offline retail world, at least for point of sale data or market sizing and shared data, it's the standard. In many ways, e-commerce today is sort of where brick and mortar was when I was beginning my career, in the sense that some of the leading players don't see a reason to cooperate in what are called the co-ops, where they share their data in exchange for some data back, which gives suppliers pretty complete visibility into how big the category is and growth rates and share by retailer and manufacturer and so on. So they are very helpful, and they're helpful for the accounts that cooperate. And the good news is, Jet will be cooperating with Nielsen in the future. So we should, assuming Jet continues to operate and it's all, that remains status quo, there should be more data in the future than there is now. But then there are other sites, like the other sites within the Walmart portfolio of online sites, that don't cooperate and may not have direct data. And so then you've got to get behavioral panel data. And that comes in a couple flavors. There's e-receipt data, there's clickstream or device monitoring that can tell you sometimes what people are purchasing, or as you heard in the last couple discussions, what they're searching for or clicking on. And that data is immensely helpful if what you care mostly about is the pathway that shoppers are taking, or if it's e-receipt data, it's immensely helpful for giving you a directional point of view across many, many retailers and platforms, the size of the prize and directional insight into share. So anyway, there's a lot of detail here that we're not going to discuss. But what's important is, one, you need to understand the data sets that are available. But two, you need to know that a lot of the business questions you'll try to answer can be answered by different methodologies with more or less accuracy, granularity, or effectiveness. And all that simply means is, again, go into any exploration of data by first acknowledging, here's what I'm trying to answer, or what I want to know, and then thinking about the way each data set is collected, and how accurate it is and how granular it is. By granular, I simply mean, does it go down to the item level, UPC or ASIN? Is it collected every day or even more frequently? Because all those things matter when it comes to actually figuring out what you can do with it. And there's no silver bullets. I hate to say it. There are no silver bullets, but if you have a point of view on what data is appropriate for which types of analysis or answers, it can really save you time and grief in actually getting value from the data. Okay, so that's sort of the preamble about what defining success looks like, building a team, building a toolkit, thinking about how you get all of the foundational enablers in place before you go focus on what do you do. And like I keep emphasizing, if nothing else, you all are sitting through a day of insight and perspective from so many interesting people, operators and analysts, and I'm certain it's overwhelming. Just this day will be overwhelming. And taking time away from a day job to experience something like this can create even more tension. Because if you're like me, during sessions or in between sessions, you're looking at your email, and the emails are piling up, and you've got 1,000 items to manage, and there's issues in all these areas to focus on. So what I'm trying to really impress on you is, first, coming to a session like this, not every week, but when you can, is really important. It's so important to sort of put the periscope up and say, let me take a step back, let me see how the industry has moved, let me see what my peers are doing differently, let me see, is the puck still where I think it is, or is it moving someplace new? Because my main hope is to give you a half dozen things that you may not be doing and should be, but maybe even more valuably, tell you some things that you might be doing that you don't need to do because they don't actually move the needle. And ultimately, that's what this is all about. There's too many things that are possible to do, and you come to events sometimes, and you hear, great, there's 6 things that I need to focus on. And then within those 6 things, there's 50 specific tactics in each. And then you're responsible for Walmart.com and Walmart Grocery and Jet, and on down the list, and you've got 1,400 items, and you're designated to e-commerce, not dedicated to e-commerce. So you come out of it saying, I can't do it. So if you need an exercise to come out of an event like this with, just focus on how you're going to rationalize the work that you're planning to do for yourself. So rationalize on every one of these dimensions, okay, I'm responsible for 5 different platforms within Walmart's portfolio. What role is each one of them going to play? Is one of them the most important and strategic because it represents the most volume or the most growth potential? Within your portfolio, think of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule. If you get just a very trivial improvement on your highest velocity items, it can often yield a bigger impact than the same or an even greater improvement on your bottom 30% of items. So look at your portfolio and just pick, as many of our clients do, they pick a list of power SKUs. For some companies, it's 50. For some, it's 500. Depends on the size of your portfolio and the distribution of sales within your portfolio. But what they know is they can't manage their whole portfolio equally. So they pick. And then they look at all the work that they could do, and they use a framework for identifying, well, first diagnosing where they might have opportunities or issues, and then prioritizing, depending on what they discover, here's what I should focus on. So this is a simplified framework, and it's similar to the way I think many of us think in terms of attracting and engaging and converting shoppers, all of which actually starts with the foundation of being in distribution and available, having the right items in the right places and maintaining continuous supply. And within that, there's a ton more detail. So this is another one of those slides where we did a bunch of research and analysis behind what we're recommending. In fact, Mike has got some print copies of the playbook that we authored that anybody is welcome to take with you. But it basically says, in a broad general sense, it may be different in your category or in your company's own case, but we analyzed a lot of categories, and it's just a distillation of what we found. Here's where to focus. And it starts, reading from left to right with availability, because if you're not available, it doesn't matter how well you execute the rest of it. Nobody can buy something that's not in distribution or that isn't in stock. So that's the fundamental starting point. And it doesn't sound as exciting in many cases as SEO or SEM or enhanced content or the stuff that we all get really excited about. the more creative and more, but if you ask us, if you're trying to find the ROI in e-commerce and you need a place to focus, with nothing else, knowing nothing else about your business, I would take a look at your best performing items or your highest velocity items and look for any opportunity to improve on-shelf availability. It's not a coincidence that it's the same thing that Walmart tells people in their brick and mortar stores. You can do all the other things so well, but if you're not maximizing your on-shelf availability, you're missing the biggest opportunity. Boy, I love these spider charts. So this one, again, there's detail behind it that we're not going to go through in depth today, but I share it because it is another important way to help you think about prioritizing. So there's 3 different types of online retail sites, and they're not the only 3. They're definitely not the only 3 that I've described here. And I want to explain what each one of them is and then how to interpret the chart. Spearfishing is what a Walmart.com or an Amazon site is all about. And spearfishing is actually an Amazon term that they use to describe the dynamic where shoppers come to typically a site that ships nationally and has an endless aisle, and people know what they're looking for when they come to the site. You heard all the great stats about Amazon as the primary destination for product search. People are spearfishers when they come to Amazon. I know what I'm looking for, I expect you to carry it, and I expect to find it instantly when I search. That's why you'll notice the green circle is so focused, search goes all the way to the end. It's because the dominant pathway to products at Amazon and Walmart.com is search. It's more important to really outperform or optimize search on a spearfishing site that ships nationally, has a huge assortment, because the average order size is just a few items, and search is the primary way people are shopping. Boxes refers to sites like Boxed. Has anybody ever shopped on Boxed? So it's a site that has a lot of similarity in some ways to Amazon. It ships nationally, but they are trying to overcome some of the economic challenges by forcing people or encouraging people into larger average orders. I think their average order is 10 to 12 items. They use bulk packs so that the items, the retail price exceeds the cost to ship, and a very limited assortment. So in that model, search, matters, but the reality is there's nowhere near the selection or the competition that there is in a spearfishing model. So if you're approaching that model, you might focus on search, but a little less than you focus on category placement. And then finally, our full basket, and that's a common term to refer to models like Walmart grocery, where rather than one item or 2 items at a time, people are building a full basket, including perishable and temperature-sensitive items for an inherently local shop. Whether you pick it up or it's delivered, full basket simply means, full basket, local, almost always grocery. And there again, what you focus on varies, because when people are building an order of 10 or 15 or 20 items, they often are spending more time browsing through the hierarchy. It also really matters what they've purchased in the past. So I share that framework simply because depending on where you're focused, if all you care about is Jet, you may emphasize some things over Walmart grocery. If all you care about is Walmart grocery, you will definitely focus on things differently than you would Jet. Now this is a topic that I'm sure nobody wants to discuss, and I should probably just breeze through it. But there have been some headlines, some media reports that there is price competition between Walmart and Amazon. And in fact, some of those media reports cite data from some studies that we've done. Every quarter, we publish a study of around 50,000 items that we're monitoring every day at many of the largest retailers, online retailers in the US. We only look at exactly the same items, so same UPC, same pack configuration every day. Both items, or the item has to be in stock at all these retailers. And what we've seen pretty unequivocally is the price gaps, that is, between the retailer that's got the leading price and the retailer that's closest, the price gaps have been narrowing pretty steadily in most categories over the last 18 months. So we hear it anecdotally from our clients, but the data supports that the competition is intensifying. And for a fairly deep cut reference, there's a movie, early 80s movie called War Games. And in another version of this presentation, again, if you want the extended director's cut of the pricing data, I include a screenshot from that movie that says, "This is a strange game. The only way to win is not to play." And I think it feels that way to a lot of suppliers because all these decisions are at the retailer's discretion. There's a lot of limitations on what you can do, but there are things that you can do. So I do want to highlight just a couple things that we've seen in our data and share a couple things that you can do. And then again, I would point you to the extended study for even more detail. But one thing we can see is that CPG categories versus non-CPG, and the report breaks down in detail how CPG is defined or what it includes. They are more competitive than non-CPG. So these three are indexed to Amazon, which was the price leader in the study. And you can see, Walmart, at least for the period that we looked at, is equally competitive essentially on CPG and non-CPG. But Jet is much more competitive on CPG, as is Target, than non-CPG. And that's important because CPG items tend to be at lower price points, lower margins, they're purchased more frequently. And so, the role that they play in both brick and mortar formats and online is often the trip driver or the frequency driver, but it really creates economic pressure on both these retailers and then, by extension on suppliers when the downward pressure on prices reaches levels that it is now and is sustained over periods as long as it has been. Here's more detail across three of the categories that roll up into CPG, including a couple other retailers for reference. What I really want to highlight are a couple of the common dynamics. And you've heard discussions of AI and algorithmic dynamic repricing engines, and generally it's true. It's powered by technology, some of it arguably intelligent. Sometimes it looks pretty unintelligent. But this is live data from one of our client accounts that reflects a pretty common dynamic, which is simply that in every one of these cases, there's what we term a first mover and a follower. And so we've got an analytic that identifies who is the retailer that's firing first, in essence, when there's a floor price established in the market and somebody goes below that floor price, others then follow, which has happened with this kind of reporting. And what you'll see is, the rules of the game are not particularly intelligent in every case. This is an example where a marketplace seller who knows whether they were authorized or unauthorized, whether they have steady supply or maybe got liquidated or closeout supply, they lower the floor price. Then there's a promoted price at a specialist retailer. Then, one retailer, in this case Amazon, matches it. And before you know it, there's this cascading effect so that either a supply chain, weak point in the supply chain that allowed one rogue or unauthorized seller get a limited quantity, or what one account team thought was a targeted promotion funded at one retailer. Either way, it gets amplified across the entire landscape. And every retailer, including the retailers that we're all here to discuss, has a pretty standard response, which is we never fire first. We simply meet the market where it is. And so, you know, other than building a fact base and going to these retailers with some perspective on how it's impacting your business, you can't expect them to answer any differently than their standard script. But I will say, actually, this is just a very quick example. You know, I will say there are beginning to be signs, and I think Walmart and Jet are setting the right examples. There are beginning to be signs of more sustainable pricing architectures emerging in the online channel. So once Walmart started offering discounts for picking up online orders at the store, we started looking at how Amazon was pricing versus Walmart. And it doesn't seem to be too widespread, but there is sort of an eerie coincidence. Some items are exactly 5% lower on Amazon than Walmart, which just leads us to wonder, are they basically setting their everyday shelf price equivalent to the discount if you pick the order up in store? I can't say with certainty what the answer is, but it wouldn't surprise me. We see that kind of asymmetrical pricing every week, and it's changing all the time. And you know, the AI or the algorithms are getting more and more sophisticated. They can detect different prices. They can account for those kind of incentives. So don't put it past them. And you know, you recently have seen, I don't know if on the new Walmart.com that's coming, we're going to see the same thing, but you have also started to see Walmart display different prices for the same item if you choose to pick it up in the store or have it delivered. This is actually a pretty big departure from the established or the conventional thinking over the last half decade or so in e-commerce. You know, the previous expectation was, or assumption was that nobody was willing to pay for convenience, and even though the cost to serve in a channel might be different, it was on the retailer to absorb any of the gap between what I can effectively deliver through a large-scale optimized supply chain and brick and mortar retail and what it's going to cost me to ship the same item in the same configuration to your doorstep. So this is simply saying, listen, we've got it a couple ways. If you want us to, you know, get it to you on your doorstep with our vehicle and our labor and our fuel, it's going to cost a little bit more. And so I'm not here to say free shipping is going away, but I am here to say this, to me, is a positive sign because this elephant in the room in e-commerce about challenging or unsustainable economics is a function of this game that nobody can win, the irrational pricing architectures that have persisted for years and years. And it's a good thing to see the retailers start to say, you know what, let's see if we can find a way to help shoppers that want the convenience, pay for the convenience. And if they'd rather trade their time for a little money, we can help them save even more. And so we think it's pretty important for the industry to get beyond item level price matching and price competition. And some of the mechanics that you see in Jet's Smart Cart and some of the examples that I just shared from Walmart are generally worth encouraging and supporting. Are they all going to be here in 5 years? I doubt it. Are they all going to be here in a month? I don't know. What I do know is, you know, in the short term, there's a lot that we'll have to do tactically in these areas. But in the long term, we want to be getting away from everyday price matching their promotion, immediately chasing a third-party seller to the bottom, and so on down the list. It's not going to be sustainable. And the retailers, I think, know it. They just haven't found what comes next. And so there's an opportunity for suppliers to experiment and help them get there sooner rather than later. In the meantime, it is really helpful to analyze the dynamic for your products, see what you can learn about which retailers are firing first and following to the extent that you can. Identify the third-party sellers that have the most sustainable supply and are most persistently causing problems. You're probably going to struggle to, this is a game of whack-a-mole, but you saw a slide earlier referencing, attorneys that can chase this. There's a couple other tactics that are effective in some cases. You'll never be able to catch them all, but if you can identify and focus on the biggest sources of unauthorized supply, it's a start. And then profitability is not only a function of price, but it's your cost structure. And so price pack architecture in your supply chain, as the channel matures, the volume builds and the economics get more and more important to executives, that's actually where to spend a ton of effort. And in the organization study that you can review, there's not a lot of companies, but there's enough to get me excited that are dedicating people to analyzing supply chain and economics to try to get on a path to sustainable profitability. That's really important. The rest of this would take all day to cover, but there is an extended deck, and there's a recording of how to do some of this stuff if it's helpful to you. But there's more to cover. So traffic, you've heard a lot about. I just want to give you a very quick framework for how to, again, identify how to focus. If you're just getting started with SEO, you want to look for the sweet spot at the intersection of keyword frequency and relevance. Keyword frequency simply means what are people searching for most often. And in some cases, you'll get that data directly from retailers. Some give it to you free, some make you pay for it. In other cases, they won't share it with you, or if they will share it with you, it's only opportunistically. You've got to ask the right person. They'll send you a spreadsheet once a quarter. In other cases, you can get to it creatively. Start typing in a keyword into the retailer search engine, and if they've got predictive search, you'll see a list of keywords that their algorithm suggests. There are third-party behavioral panels that can give you structured reports. The bottom line is you want to find a source of reasonably accurate data to tell you how often are people searching for different terms. And then you want to identify the terms that are most representative of your portfolio and most relevant to your portfolio. And that's where you start focusing. Some companies, especially if they did SEO or SEM in a traditional search engine context, where there are tools that let you manage thousands of keywords at scale, you come to Insight or e-commerce SEO and you think it'll be no big deal to optimize for 1,000 keywords. You've heard all day long. This is about updating your titles, your feature bullets, your description, which can be really challenging and tedious. So you can't do 1,000 keywords, for every product. But I will say, to build on some of the comments that you heard earlier, it's not only important to be in some of those top positions on page one, but just getting to page one itself can yield an incredible impact. We in the analysis that sits behind this study, we looked at Amazon, where we have full visibility into keyword traffic and sales. what we saw was that for the most frequently searched keywords, in the 95th percentile and up, getting an item that was not on page one onto page one yielded 100% sales lift, post versus pre. Doesn't matter if you're at the bottom or the top of the page, getting on page one effectively doubled your sales for the most frequently searched keywords. So again, don't feel like you have to go change every product's title, description, bullets, et cetera, for every keyword. Pick the right products, identify the right keywords, make the right tweaks. Conversion, just to really oversimplify, can be a function of a couple things. Things that you directly control, like content, and things that are a little less under your control, like user-generated content, reviews, questions, and answers. You should manage what you can in both of those areas. So this virtuous cycle I described as it relates to content, I think is important. And it does start with, ideally, benchmarking what good content looks like. So many companies just start with, here's the content I have. I've got to vomit it into each platform as quickly as I can. And that's fair, the time is of the essence. But if you're trying to step back and be thoughtful about how you can get even more leverage from the team and the time and the tools that you've got, look at what the outperformers are doing. Look at what the items on page one of the keywords you want to win are doing. If you have visibility into sales or share, look at what the items or the brands that are winning have done. How many images do they have? What percentage of their items have enhanced content? How many feature bullets, or what is the structural content of their feature bullets, and on down the list? Look at those things. Then develop the content. Be sure that you're managing it as efficiently as you can and syndicating it as efficiently as you can. And then the auditing or the analysis of it really has two objectives. Auditing is pretty basic. It's just making sure that what was supposed to be syndicated was syndicated. Analyzing it, though, is more about effectiveness. Is the stuff that we thought was going to be effective actually effective? Did I improve my search position? Did I improve my conversion rate? Was all that money that I spent on the studio and the agency and did it move the needle? And sometimes it doesn't. For some items or some types of content, it doesn't. And if you know that, you don't have to spend the time and money. So these are just examples of what we do. I do want to spend a minute on the user-generated content. Reviews are an important starting point. Nobody wants to be a guinea pig. So if you've got items that have no reviews, prioritize those. It's so important to have reviews be authentic and genuine. So there's all kinds of gray or black hat stuff that used to get suggested. My suggestion is don't do any of it. But there are above board ways to, through sampling and so on, to get real people familiar with your product and leave genuine reviews. And if you've got items that don't have any reviews, it's a good thing to do. It's typically not cheap because beyond the samples, you're paying somebody a fee. So you're not going to do it for your whole portfolio. But then secondly, increasingly, while people love the specs and the features and the bullets and all of your romance copy that your marketers and your brand managers write, if you're like me, and a lot of shoppers are, they trust their peers who they perceive not to have any kind of paid agenda equally or more, and so they're looking at the star rating and the reviews and the customer Q&A. So it's good to be able to identify and respond to customer questions that haven't received an answer from somebody on your customer service team, or a negative review, simply to show that you care and you're responsive. And we've seen a meaningful improvement in conversion rates when that level of responsiveness is there. A lot of companies are just taking their existing consumer response or customer service teams and assigning this, making them the designated service team for this. Okay. So, we have covered a lot of ground in this session, but I think all day. And I really came to this event with, again, the simple objective of trying to give you the distilled point of view of my experience and what we see in our data and what our clients sort of report back to us about, first, all of the things that enable them to succeed, whether they're a one-person band or whether they've got a team of 200 folks dedicated to e-commerce globally. And in our client roster, we've got both profiles. And then beyond that, once you know how you're going to define success, who's going to be part of the team, what tools they need or what tools they have, what are we going to focus on first? And so, I'm not trying to create homework for anybody, but look inside your customer portfolio, different sites or platforms. If Walmart Grocery is the big one, be explicit about that. Write it on a sticky note next to your desk and tell everybody that you work with, for the next quarter, here's where we're going to prioritize our efforts. Look inside your portfolio and just decide, I'm not going to try and manage every single item equally because they don't all represent equal potential. Take a look at the different activities you can do and try and pinpoint the ones that are going to yield the biggest impact. And I think you'll start getting more from the same effort or the same team or the same budget pretty quickly. So thank you to Bill and Amanda and everybody for the event. I think the best thing about events like this is meeting peers and people in the community. So I hope you all think of this as a good opportunity to meet people that will help carry you in your careers and give as much as you get. And like I say, if you've got questions or want any of the materials I kept referencing, be in touch. I'm happy to help however I can.